Well, let's read Genesis 18, and then Minister Joe and I are going to dissect it and talk through what occurs to us as we try to reflect on this. This is Genesis 18, New Revised Standard Version, beginning in verse 1. It says, the Lord appeared to Abraham, and I want to remind you, whenever you see capital L, small capital letters, O-R-D, where this is the divine name. So this is Yahweh. So the Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre. That's why we did that little map thing. So it's near Hebron. As he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day, he looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. He said, my Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you've come to your servant. So they said, do as you have said. And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, knead it, and make cakes. Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant, who hastened to prepare it. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree while they ate. They said to him, where is your wife Sarah? And he said, there in the tent. Then one said, I'll surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I've grown old, and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure? The Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I'm old? Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son. But Sarah denied, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. He said, oh yes, you did laugh. Let's stop there for now. I mean, we could read the rest of the passage, but that gets into the whole Sodom and Gomorrah thing. I think we have enough here to just get started, don't you think?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, we didn't discuss in advance if you want to be the questioner or the questioned, Minister Joe, but we'll probably go back and forth. But I'll give you first dibs at this. I've already done the history as we've looked at the geography and where Abraham is at this point. What stands out to you here as we get to the beginning of the passage?
Well, yeah, right. Well, first thing first is there's 3 men that come. And so the begging question is, who in the world are they?
Yeah, and it would be premature at this part of the passage to say, right? So one thing I want to point out, we'll do this just, I should have done this at the beginning. The reason I pointed out again that this capital L, small capital letters O-R-D is the divine name is in verse 3, Abram says, my Lord. But you'll notice that that is small letters. Those are lowercase letters because that is the name Adonai. So he's not identifying this person as God. Adonai just means master. It's appropriate. It would be like calling you Mr. Baldinger or Reverend Baldinger. It's like using a title of respect, but it's not indicating, he's not using the name of God. Mm-hmm. So that's important. And it would be premature at this point for us to associate these people with God at the beginning, because it doesn't say Abraham recognized them.
Right.
But the question, who are they, lingers throughout, right? Mm-hmm. And we get a sense that these are more than just travelers pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Right, pretty quickly. So yeah, 3 men show up. What do you make of Abraham's response to them?
Well, he definitely has a deep respect for them, and calls them Lord, calls them, he does all the things that you would do for special guests,
Yeah, especially in our culture, right? But one thing I do want to point out, and maybe you know this, Minister Joe, maybe you're setting me up, but this would be the expected reception of any traveler in the ancient world. They were supposed to be hospitable. So Abraham is not doing anything exceptional here by the cultural standards, but he is meeting the cultural standards wonderfully. Mm. He's not selfish. He's not looking for an excuse. He is he's using titles of respect, which in this culture you're supposed to do. And he is offering them food, which in this culture you're supposed to do. Now, the question is he going above and beyond by fresh making the bread and by sacrificing a new lamb and preparing it? How long would this take? Have you ever, you're not a butcherer of animals, Minister Joe, but this is not a small process he engages in.
It'd be there a long time, even if it was a small animal. I mean, to cook it, and it'd take hours.
Yeah, he's got to slaughter it, he's got to butcher it, and then he's got to cook.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Now, maybe, I don't know, in the movies, you always see them like they just throw the animal on a spit and just start cooking it. But there's a lot of preparation. Even if you were to cook an animal that way, there's a lot of preparation in advance.
Right. This brings on a whole new meaning of fast food, huh?
Yeah. So it's a pretty big meal. Now, I've been told by commentators and by professors that Abraham might be going a little bit beyond the expectation, but not by much. We live in a very different world. If somebody knocks on your door, you do not invite them in, you don't cook them a meal. But that would have been an expected type of hospitality in Abraham's culture, especially for people who are traveling.
Right.
Because,
the washing of the feet and stuff like that was, he doesn't, I think I always pictured that he washed their feet, but he made the stuff available to them. That it can get pretty nasty.
He didn't wash their feet necessarily, but he made everything available to them, offered them a place within his territory and his tents to rest, had Sarah make bread for them, which is not a fast process. Not even fast today, if I were to make fresh bread for you with all of our technology, let alone in those days. And then he hastens to have his servants prepare an animal, a living animal for food. And then he also takes dairy products. Mm-hmm. So this is quite a spread.
There's a sense that there's that everything's fresh, and that there's something about that. There's also something that hit me, but I don't know why. And it's the idea that he was sitting at the entrance of his tent. And all I can think is, like, maybe, when I go camping, or I've been in a tent before, inside the tent at the peak of the day is the hottest time to be in the tent. So I thought maybe at the entrances, I get this visual of kind of a canopy that goes over the entrance that makes a little bit of shade, but they have the big oaks of Mamre there. So I would think it might've been cooler temperature wise.
Yeah.
Underneath these big oaks. And so,
I don't know why he's sitting at the entrance to the tent, but it reminds me of the story of Cain and Abel, when God says to Cain, sin is crouching at your tent flap. It desires to have you. There's a certain sense in the story where there's an alertness, that Abram is at his tent opening. He's alert. He's watching. And because he's watching, he sees these three travelers. Now, had he been in the tent, he wouldn't have. And had he been someplace else. So I think there's a sense of alertness here. And Abraham responds to these three people. The reason I'm making a big deal of the fact that this is expected in this culture is I don't want people to come to the impression that Abraham goes out of his way like this because he knows he's talking to God. This smacks much more like what Paul says. Be hospitable and generous with strangers, for some have entertained angels unaware. I think he is hearkening back to the story of Abraham. Paul is suggesting, treat strangers with great respect. You don't know who you're dealing with. And Abraham, early in this story, doesn't know who he's dealing with. These are just strangers. Now, he's going to find out soon enough that they're more than that. But there's no indication he knew that from go. So he doesn't lavish this kind of generosity on them because he knows he's entertaining important people. This is just Abraham being hospitable. Turns out it's a good thing he was.
Yeah.
He is literally entertaining angels unawares. Exactly as Paul said could happen when you're generous.
Well, it is interesting that the chapter starts out with that section where the Lord appeared to him.
Yeah.
So there's something there. That's a setup.
It is, because we know this is the Lord.
Mhm.
But there's no indication that Abraham knew. And the textual evidence of that is he just calls these people, one of these people who's clearly maybe in charge of the other two, he calls him Adonai. That is not Abraham's word for God. He'll call God El Shaddai, Yahweh even though that name's not been revealed yet. The Moses or whoever wrote Genesis puts it in the mouth of Abraham so that we know Abraham knows who he's talking to. But he doesn't call him Adonai. I mean, he doesn't call him Yahweh, doesn't call him El Shaddai, doesn't call him Elohim, doesn't call him God. He just calls this person Lord, Adonai, a typical, it's like sir. One of the translations is sir for Adonai. So there's no indication that I can see in the text that Abraham knows right away who he's talking to. But of course, we know who's come. The question is why three? And are all three Yahweh or just one of them? Those are questions that are forthcoming. Because some people see the Trinity in this. And that would be an error, I think. But maybe not.
Yeah, for some reason, and I know it's not accurate, but the three wise men come to mind.
Yeah.
I don't know why, but that's inside.
Yeah, well, we want to be careful, right? Because the scriptures don't actually say how many magi there were. It just says that there were three gifts.
Yeah.
So who knows? Maybe.
Right. That's a rabbit trail.
Yeah. These three kings of Orient are right. That's just mythological, based on the three gifts that they bring. Mm-hmm. But it becomes clear to Abraham, not really quickly, because he has to do all this food preparation, which probably took hours and hours. Right. But eventually, when they are talking with him, it becomes clear that these are more than just travelers. Mm-hmm. And we already knew that. But Abraham is coming to know it in verse 9, right? Because they start talking about Sarah, and they're going to bring up a prophecy that was a personal conversation between Abraham and God. So that is going to clue Abraham in that these are not just any travelers.
Do you think Abraham got a little nervous when they said, "Where's your wife?"
I wonder. Yeah, I wonder. It's an interesting way to start the conversation, right? I mean, what does that imply to you? Where is your wife, Sarah? Why do you suppose they asked that question? That's a great observation.
Well, the promise can't be fulfilled without her being around. But obviously, there is that concept too of have you she's not there because you can't make this happen with her, kind of thing. Yeah. Or have you sent her away? Maybe one thought. But I was thinking also that just as a human, and because of Egypt, and with Pharaoh, and because of Abimelech, three guys come to your door and they're looking for your wife. That might make me a little nervous.
Yeah, there's a lot in the story that you could imagine this is not considered an idle question, by these three men. I don't know how Abraham responded. One thing that this question definitely reveals is that Sarah did not welcome them the way Abraham did. Mm-hmm. Right? So now he knows that this is an angel. And remember, the angel of the Lord is generally who appears to the people in the First Testament when God wants to talk to them. Only Moses is said to have talked to the Lord face to face. So it's almost always the angel of the Lord, even when it's not mentioned. And this clearly seems to be an angelic visitation once verse 10 arrives. And one of the men, probably the one who looks like the leader, the one who Abraham addressed, Lord, sir, says, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." Mm-hmm. Now, if Abraham had any doubt who these three men were or who this one leading man was, it's wiped away now. I mean, it's clearly that this is a messenger from God.
Well, he knows her name.
Or more.
He also knows her name. And so...
the new name, too.
Yeah, it wasn't like he, it doesn't say in the text, but he didn't say, well, I'm Abram and this is my wife Sarah, or Sarai, or Abraham and this is my wife Sarai. You
That's an
know?
important observation. The question of where Sarah is also indicates they know who she is
Mhm.
and knows he's married. So these are not strangers. Now, if we think Abraham knew this all the way through, we just read this as a matter of course. But if we recognize we've been told who has visited him, but he doesn't know yet, now all these questions start to make sense. Like they're trying to tell him who they are, right? With very personal questions. If somebody showed up at your door and said, I'm just traveling through, and you said, oh, can I get you some food? And they say, where's your wife, Tammy? You'll go, who are you?
Right. Right.
It's going to catch your attention. So Sarah's listening to all this. She hears them say that she's going to have a son. And we're told now what we expected, that Sarah's gone through menopause.
Mm-hmm.
That's what verse 11 indicates, right?
Mm-hmm.
It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So she's gone through menopause. She is not expecting to have children anymore.
Right.
We already know she's in her 90s, right? Just entering her 90s or so.
Right.
So Sarah laughs. And actually the language is better in the Hebrew here.
Yeah.
Because she says her husband is as good as dead.
Oh.
So should I have this pleasure? I'm old and my husband is good as dead.
Mm.
Shall I have this pleasure? I've got a real interesting thing to talk to you about later that I read from a rabbi once, but we'll get to that in a minute, about this passage, trying to interpret this passage. So she laughs.
Mm.
Now, we've seen that before. When Abraham was told in chapter 17 that Sarah was going to have a son, he laughed.
Right.
Which is why this child's name is supposed to be Isaac.
Mm.
But they call attention to the fact that she laughed.
Mm.
What is there a difference between Abram's laughter in 17 and Sarah's laughter here?
It's a good question. It's easier because it's fresh in our mind right now why she laughed. But yeah, I think so, because I think in 17 it seems like he's laughing, that Abram laughs because all these changes are about to happen. His name changed, her name changed, and their age is the issue. Here it seems like it has to do with the child.
Yeah. Do you think, like, one thing I think that can help with the conversation, it occurs to me that Sarah should have known about this if Abraham shared with her what he was told in chapter 17. Like, typically you don't laugh the third time or the second time or the fifth time you hear something. It's usually a reaction to the first time. Like, I don't know, maybe I'm overreading, but it feels to me like this is the first time she heard it. She's like, what? I'm old. My husband's as good as dead.
Right.
I'm going to bear a child. Does that beg the question as to why Abraham didn't tell her what he was told in chapter 17?
Yeah, it sure seems like it. It sure seems like I haven't been talking. It's been a few years. I would think from 17 to 19, or chapters. The chapter.
Yeah.
There's been some time here, and so I'm sorry if I'm skipping around a little too much.
No, you're not. It's a very hard question to address. That's why I'm kind of bantering it about. My impression is that I might be overreading, Minister Joe. So you just correct me and rail me in if you think that I am. But I think asking why did Sarah laugh was as much an interrogation as to what Abraham had or had not told her, as it is a question meant to elicit a response from Sarah. Like if God had visited you 2 years ago and said, your wife is going to have a child, or is going to get a job at this place, or something like that, or she's going to become ill, or she's going to get ill, but she's going to get better, whatever. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, however long it was, God came and told you that. And then he comes back 3 years later and gives you the same information. And your wife responds as though she's never heard it before. And then he says, why is your wife laughing? Doesn't that as much question Abraham as it does Sarah?
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's how it feels to me. Like, I feel like this is, you didn't tell her?
Yeah.
Like, why is she laughing?
Right. Yeah. It's like, yeah. I think you guys need to go to marital counseling.
It feels that way to me. Now, it's possible that Sarah did hear it before, but she didn't really believe it. And now she's hearing it in someone else's mouth and she's responding. That's possible, but that's not how I'm reading it. I think when he says, why did Sarah laugh? He's questioning why Abraham didn't tell her.
Yeah.
And then he says in verse 14, is anything too wonderful for the Lord?
Mm-hmm.
To me, this is a conversation entirely about Abraham. Now, Sarah's still overhearing it, so she's going to deny laughing.
Mm-hmm.
But I think this is about Abraham. Did you not tell her because you don't believe? I mean, is anything too wonderful? Why didn't you tell her that we had this conversation? That's what I think is behind it. And then he tells him, more or less, I'm going to come back here in this season next year, and Sarah will have a son. So I think that's what's happening. And then Sarah responds, still listening at the tent flap as far as we know. I didn't laugh because she was afraid. What do you think she's afraid of?
She's afraid of being pregnant.
Or it's becoming clear that this is God. Somehow this person is representing God.
Mm-hmm.
And now he's just said, is anything too wonderful for the Lord? And now Sarah's in the uncomfortable position of having laughed at God. And so it seems to me she thinks, I'll just deny it, which that's bizarre, right? Maybe it means she didn't laugh out loud. Maybe it was inside.
Yeah.
And so it's but he knows. This so strikes me of Jesus. Now, I'm not saying this is Jesus. I'm saying it so strikes me of Jesus when he knows what's going on in somebody's heart and they try to deny it. And he's like, no. I know what you were thinking.
No, it's the heart of man. Yeah.
I think that's some of the what's going on here. So it's a very interesting scene, and Abraham is clear that he's being visited by an angel of the Lord.
Mm.
And that this person is talking to him on God's behalf. I don't think, you tell me how you feel, Minister Joe. I don't want to go so far as to say this is God in the flesh, though some commentators do. They'll say that this is a theophany, a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus to Abraham, or this is God himself in the flesh. I push against that for a couple reasons. First, almost everything in the First Testament is mediated by angels. Mm-hmm. And so this is most likely, in my view, the angel of the Lord. Secondly, the First Testament is pretty clear that Moses is the only person who's ever spoken with God face to face on this side of things. And Abraham, that claim is never made of Abraham. So I'm still thinking there's a mediation here. But I don't know. How do you feel about that? Do you think that he's talking with someone who represents God? So clearly he's talking to someone who is speaking for God. But do you think he's talking to God? Do you think these three are the Trinity incarnate here, that these three are the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit? I've heard so many sermons that present it that way.
No.
I wonder what you think.
No, I don't think at all that it's the Trinity. I think that's something that somebody else is trying to protect by talking that way. I think that the three is a way of reinforcing the presence, and then the presence of God. I think that it starts out that passage that way, saying that God appeared, or Yahweh appeared to Abraham. And I think it says that, and then reveals that he calls them lords, Adonai, like you said before. I think that very clearly says that is a messenger of God.
And these people are talking on God's behalf, and yeah. I want to make that very clear, because I can hear, like in my head, people saying, "Yeah, but verse 13, look at this. It says the Lord. It says Yahweh said to Abraham." And yes, these are absolutely speaking on God's behalf. One thing we can forget in the First Testament is the narrative technique of not putting in too many clunky details. So once you know the angel of the Lord or the word of the Lord is coming to Abraham, after that it will just say the Lord. But that doesn't mean the mediation is gone. You see the same thing in the story of Moses, for instance. We're told at the very beginning of that story that Moses is never going to speak to Pharaoh. It's always going to be Aaron speaking. God's going to speak to Moses. Moses is going to speak to Aaron, and Aaron will speak to Pharaoh. Now, we're told that at the very beginning, but then after you get into the story, it always says Moses said. So you can be left with the idea that Charlton Heston is giving all these lines, like in the movie The
Right.
Ten Commandments.
Yeah.
But that's not the case. Aaron is always the one speaking to Pharaoh, but he's speaking on behalf of Moses, so the text just says Moses said. Same thing here. This is God speaking. Whether there's an angel mediating it or not, it's coming directly from the Lord. So it is the Lord speaking. But we shouldn't forget there's a mediator here. There's an angelic mediator, and that's highlighted in the book of Hebrews, for instance, where it says that the old covenant was mediated by angels.
Yeah, but to call it a theophany is different.
A theophany is the theory that Jesus himself, the Son, the second person of the Trinity, could appear as a human being in the First Testament prior to being incarnated in the womb of Mary and being born as Jesus. That's technically a theophany. And some people think that's what's happening here.
Yeah, I'm saying that I disagree with that because it doesn't. I don't see the necessity of saying that. There's nothing pointing to the fact that it has to happen.
And these are physical beings that appear.
Yeah.
Well, when God appears, like God himself appears, it's much more dramatic than this.
And it specifically says men.
Yeah, three men.
Three men.
Who are they're angels. They're bringing a message from God, from the Lord. But so I think the 3 is an important number, though, and I'm not sure it's important because of the Trinity, but it's important for another reason, I think, and we'll probably get into that as we get into Sodom and Gomorrah.
Well, I mean, ready or not, Sarah's got to get ready. You're gonna be with child soon.
Yeah, and Abraham will be 99, I think, or 100 years old, I think, when the child's conceived. Yeah, I think so, because he was already told it was going to be a year from chapter 17, right? Am I right about that? We got to look back at that, Minister Joe, because we might have been talking about this a little differently. Let me see. I'm back in chapter 17. We're doing this live, so sometimes... what does he say? Are you looking with me?
No.
Oh, thanks for letting me do all the heavy lifting here.
There you go. You're a good lifter. Lift those arms up. Yeah, but the one of the things that just popped in my head was if this was a theophany, why would Jesus have to eat the calf? And
so we'll get to that theophany. Yeah, you're right. Why would he need to eat? Of course, he does eat fish after he rises from the dead, but that's after he's incarnated. So this is 1721. So way back in 17, you had mentioned at the beginning, I should have done this research, how long of a distance there was between chapter 17 and 18. It doesn't look to me like it's too many, because it says, "But my covenant I'll establish with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this season next year."
Oh.
So in 17, he's saying a year from now she'll have a child. So I'm guessing 18 is not that much further along. Because it's still a distance, right? She's not even pregnant yet.
Right.
So it has to be within 3 months of chapter 17 that these guys show up.
Which is interesting. Because it makes it almost a whole total sidebar.
Yeah.
Chapter 18, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. But they're not there to tell Abraham this. We're going to find out why they actually have arrived.
Right.
They just happen to tell him that. I'm thinking this now. I kind of mentioned it earlier, but it's feeling stronger now that this new detail we've uncovered. I wonder if part of the question was because Abraham still hadn't told Sarah. And she's going to get pregnant pretty soon. So maybe, we're passing through Abraham's territory. Let's stop by. Let's give him a little kick in the pants to talk to his wife. And we'll have this conversation with him.
Yeah. He's as good as dead, she said.
Yeah, it's pretty clear to me that he hadn't told her yet, but now we have the time frame down. It's got to be within about 3 months of the last visitation, but he still hasn't talked to her. I think that's what's happening. It's a guess. It's conjecture.
He wasn't even trying. Is that what everyone?
Yeah, because when she says he's as good as dead, it seems to me that they're not being intimate.
Yeah.
I mean, what else could that mean?
Yeah.
So I think her point is we're not even being intimate. How is that going to happen?
Right.
And it's God's kind of like, Abraham, we had a conversation. Right. Can you tell me why Sarah's laughing when she hears about it?
Right.
So anyway, I think that's what's going on here. So here's something that comes out of this passage I read from a rabbi once, and I'm curious as to your response. Until I read it, just to give you a little bit of the context, I was reading a series of debates on whether it's ever okay to lie was part of the debate, and still is it ever biblically moral to lie was the question. And a subsidiary part of that was, does the Bible require for truth to always give all of the truth, or can you leave things out for different reasons? That was this debate I was reading. And it was a rabbinic debate over this. And of course, it brought up people like Rahab, who lied about hiding the spies and was blessed by God, and some other situations like that. But finally, it brought us to this story of Abraham and Sarah and pointed out a detail I had never noticed before. And I'll do it as best I can and see how you respond and our people respond, because I think it's interesting. So this is verse 12. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I've grown old and my husband is old, but the sense is that he's nearly dead, shall I have this pleasure? The Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I'm old? The rabbi recognized that God left something out. Because Sarah didn't just say that she was old. She also said Abraham was old. So why didn't God tell Abraham everything Sarah said? And the rabbi said, God left out a detail that could have hurt their relationship. And so he kept that to himself. And sometimes we need to learn to keep truth to ourselves that would not do anybody any good. And so it was kind of a lesson, like God is not a gossip. He's not going to tell you everything somebody said, especially if it could destabilize the relationship. And this rabbi was using that as an argument that having a commitment to the truth is not an excuse to just say anything you want to say. How do you respond to that? I can't read the story anymore without hearing that conversation after I read it. I mean, I never had thought about that before. I didn't notice that God didn't give Abraham all the information of what Sarah said, but it is clearly there in the text. He left out a detail. What do you make of that? I know I didn't prepare you in advance, so you're responding to this like for the first time. So I'm not expecting anything profound. I'm still not sure what I make of it. But what do you, how do you respond to that?
Well, yeah, there is an aspect of the truth. The truth can hurt. And there's a reality of as well of realizing whether or not it's beneficial to know everything. It reminds me of the movie, you can't handle the truth, kind of thing. And there's to some degree, you have to ask yourself, what is the value of, or the importance of revealing that to you? Especially if you think it's going to do harm. So
why do you think God told Abraham that Sarah laughed and said that she was old, but did not reveal to him that she also said Abraham was old? It's a very interesting insight, right? It's a curious detail. I'm not sure I want to agree with the rabbi entirely about how he concludes, but it's a really a good observation. And I am inclined to think that God might have withheld that information because it really would not have benefited them. You know, that's what the rabbi suggested. Now, he suggested that if this was the only example we had of God doing something like that, it wouldn't be enough to act on. But then he gave the example of Rahab, in which she lied and hid the spies and was blessed for it. And then he also used the example of David, when David doesn't tell the priest all the reason he needs the food. Some of you remember the story when David is fleeing from Saul, and he goes to the priests, and he wants to eat the bread that is designed by the law of Moses. The bread is set aside only for the priest to eat, but David tells the priest that he's in emergency need of it, and so the priests feed him, and then he leaves, and then Saul follows up, and David did not tell them that he was fleeing from Saul. And Saul then kills all the priests because they helped David. And they didn't know they were helping David flee Saul. They knew they were helping David, but they didn't know everything. And so the rabbi is stitching together all these stories saying a moral relationship with the truth is more complicated than we might believe. Mm. And so it was a very interesting conversation. We're not going to settle it here. But it is interesting to recognize that God tells Abraham some of what Sarah said, but not all of what Sarah said. And the detail God leaves out is a detail that might have caused a rift between Abraham and Sarah. I mean, it's probably not a great thing for a woman to say her husband's as good as dead.
Yeah, it sure makes you wonder I have other thoughts about what that might mean, but one of the things that keeps coming back to me is that if you want, why that rabbi would use those examples when you can think of Abram himself, who didn't tell the whole truth.
Yeah, he doesn't want to use, I would imagine, I'm guessing, I wouldn't want to use if it were me making the argument, I would not want to use the examples of Abimelech and Pharaoh, because that is so clearly depicted as wrong. Mm-hmm. He's trying to pick examples that are not depicted as wrong. And of course, God did this one. You're not going to say God did wrong.
Right.
So he's certainly not arguing that lying is always good.
Right.
But what he's trying to indicate is that there are behaviors commended in the scriptures that could be seen as a half-truth or as an outright deception, like in the case of Rahab. And they are not. So his argument is not that lying is always right, but he is making the case it's not always wrong. And that's
the legitimate question. I mean, your kids are going to ask those kinds of questions. You know, somebody breaking in the house, where's your parents?
Right.
Are they in the other room? You know, or
yeah.
Do they feel like there's a threat?
Just like hospitality, there's another issue in this text about hospitality, which relates to our children. Like Abraham is supposed to entertain strangers, but is your child supposed to do the same? And we know that that's how children get abducted. It's how they can be manipulated, is when they make room for strangers. So we have a kind of a rule. It's a guideline in our house, certainly, where I tell the kids, if somebody comes up to them, even if it's somebody they know from church or someplace else, comes up to them in the yard, that they are allowed to be rude by leaving and coming to the house and getting us. And I've said to them, I will be polite, but you have to be rude. Not by saying rude things, but by not talking to them.
Yeah.
And that's because there is a sense of who should be hospitable. And that's in this story too. It's not Sarah who goes out and greets. It's not Eliezer, the servant, who goes out and greets. It's Abraham, as head of household, who does the greeting. And I think but again, hospitality is not for everybody. When I did youth ministry, for instance, the Bible is a lot about sharing your faith and eating with tax collectors and sinners. But how many youth pastors would recommend that their students go to drinking parties so that they can be a witness? Yeah. Like, we would never recommend that, right?
They wouldn't have a job very long.
Yeah, absolutely. But Jesus certainly did go to parties that his peers didn't think he should go to, in order to be a witness, because he said it's the sick who need a doctor, not the healthy. But the difference is, with Jesus, we're talking about an adult. Mm-hmm. And with the teen party, we're talking about teenagers. Now, teenagers might have been adults in Jesus' day, but they were also enculturated entirely differently. So they were ready for adulthood by that age. For us, childhood is greatly extended. So they're still in their child years. So you'll give different advice to children than you will to full grown adults. That's the point. So what the rabbi is saying is we have to be careful making blanket statements. Everybody's supposed to be hospitable to strangers. You're going to tell your 6-year-old that? It's the sick that need a doctor, not the healthy. So that's why Christians eat with tax collectors and sinners. You going to buy that from your child when he's going to a farm party? You know what I mean? So what the rabbi is saying is be careful of these universal statements and realize that the scriptures are much more complicated, and ethics is a complicated subject, and it's never so much as just black and white. We live in a world of grays, and that's what he's suggesting here. Even God in this passage does not give Abraham all of the truth. So it's an interesting observation, right?
Yeah.
So I know you didn't expect to get into that, did you?
No.
You never know where you're running the Bible. I read probably too much. It's a very esoteric debate, but I was doing a class. Some of you might remember this class I did at New Beginnings on ethics. And one of my lectures was when ethics compete, when you have two values that you cannot satisfy at the same time, like kindness and truthfulness. Sometimes you can't be both kind and truthful, you know? So which one wins? Because whenever you're in a situation like that, you're going to choose which one is the higher value, which one is more important. Right. And how do you make that decision? We often convince ourselves that you can always satisfy all the values you hold, but you can't always do that. Sometimes your desire to set proper boundaries so people are appropriately, you treat them as adults, but then your desire to help somebody, you can't often have good boundaries and also help. So which one wins for you? Whichever one you think is the greater value. Is help more important, or are safe and consistent boundaries more important? Whichever one you think is more important is the one that will win that conversation. And so I was teaching a lecture on that. And I was doing research on the various ways of understanding how to make these ethical decisions. And so a really great example is truth and falsehood. So you always want to be truthful. I'm a pastor, right? So are you. You want to be truthful, but there's information people give you that you can't share. Mm-hmm. So you'll be in a situation where you might be being accused of something, which if you could share this truth would absolve you, but it's a truth you're not supposed to share. So do you let someone believe a lie to safeguard this truth, this piece of information you've promised not to share, or do you share the information so the truth will be known? Mm-hmm. That's difficult. Which is the more important thing? That people know the truth, or that people's secrets are safeguarded? Wow. Very difficult. So that's what I was doing. I was doing a lecture series on that. Mm-hmm. And that's how it came up. I found this great debate between rabbis, and I thought, wow, that's good.